of them. And much of the conversation I've had off camera, or on camera, but not on the air, has been about how they've been adapting at their church. And 2020 has been the year really that has forced some very fast adaptation and changes at churches, at businesses. I mean, everybody's having to change, and obviously much of that is crisis related. But I honestly believe we are going to reap the benefits of being forced to kind of change the way that a lot of things are being done. Now, that's easy for me to say because, we haven't had to close our business or anything like that. So I don't want to negate the difficulty people have been through. But when you look back, I do think you're going to see a lot of quick adaptation and change that's been very, very good. We will reap the benefits. That is a form of innovation, and that is today's topic today. And if you'll stick around, I think you will find this very interesting and very inspirational, because I absolutely love this topic. And innovation has really been what has made America the greatest nation on earth, but not the only ones that have innovated. I want to show you a book. It's called Ready or Not, Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. And this is what I want you to really hear today, and that is innovation is from God. Okay? It's part of our calling for bringing His kingdom to this earth, which I believe is the mission of every Christian on the face of the earth. The author of that book is an entrepreneur himself. He helps a lot of ministries and businesses be innovative. His name is Doug Paul, and he is with me live right now. Doug, great to have you here on Life Today Live.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Randy.
So let's start at the very top, and let's give a definition of innovation, and then we can look at some examples and some application and hopefully inspire a few people today to start praying, God, how would you have me be innovative? So let's define it.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we define it with the team that I work with is that kingdom innovation, which is the way that we're really thinking about it. It's a kingdom. We're locating it there, is that it's new, it works, and it brings glory to Jesus. So it's new, but it does not have to be a new invention, meaning sometimes we think innovation, we're thinking Thomas Edison, and there wasn't a light bulb and now there is a light bulb. Sometimes it's just the most innovative things are just very small tweaks or adjustments that we make to something. It works, meaning it's got to actually work. It can't just be something that looks good on a piece of paper but not work in reality. And then thirdly, it has to center around Jesus, that Jesus is the center of the story. The innovation isn't the center of the story. The leader isn't the center of the story. Jesus is that center.
All right, to help people start to think about this, your book, by the way, is a great read. I enjoyed it. Let's talk about some of the stories in the book, just so people get an idea of what you just said, how that looks in the real world.
So one of the stories that I think is like one of the more famous but not famous stories, because we're aware of the presence of the innovation but not aware of the story of the person who started it, was a guy named Bill Wilson, and it was in the 1920s, and he was offered a chance to actually be in Thomas Edison's laboratory as his personal apprentice. But around the same time that he got that invitation, he also discovered alcohol. And he was so addicted when he received the invitation to study under Edison, to be that personal apprentice. He didn't even respond. And for months and months and months, he had no memory of that even happening. And he went a full 14 years going the full addiction path. And at the end of the day, Bill Wilson did find sobriety, but it wasn't because he wanted to start a global movement. What he wanted to do was to stop drinking. And he in his path, he figured out how some things fit together, and the Lord brought some things together, and he had a profound supernatural experience with God. And at the end of the day, Bill Wilson was the one who founded what we now know as Alcoholics Anonymous. And it wasn't because he wanted what are now 130 million people to find freedom in Jesus and from alcohol. He just wanted to stop drinking. That's where his journey started. And I think sometimes we do despise the day of small beginnings, or that we just have a practical need,
Hmm.
and we need to actually figure out what Jesus is doing in the moment, and meet him in that need.
Yeah, and I'm sure Bill Wilson wasn't the first one to stop drinking or to try, but to your point about innovation, he found something that worked and passed it on,
Yeah.
and that's really just a good example of what innovation looks like. Now, okay, so someone's sitting at home thinking, okay, that's a great story, but who am I? I'm just an ordinary person. A housewife is one that sparks some innovation in your book. Retired teacher,
Yeah.
Um, what what should the average person, if they felt like, okay, I want to be innovative for God's kingdom. So what's the starting place to maybe give them an idea of even how to even go about that, where to look?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the starting place is where most journeys begin, which is in a place of prayer, and maybe even fasting. We're actually asking the Lord, "What have you put in front of me? What is it that you are up to that you want me to join you in?" Like Henry
Hmm.
Blackaby, I talk about his story in the book, who started this thing called experiencing God, and his general principle was like, God is always at work, join him in what he's doing. And so the first part for innovation with Kingdom Innovation, Randy, is that you actually are asking that God would give you eyes to see what he is already doing in your life.
Hmm.
I think sometimes when we think about innovation, maybe we think about tech companies, or we think about people who have like they're just the most amazing leaders you've ever seen. But some of the best kingdom innovation actually starts at the kitchen table. It starts in the laboratory of your own life. And so it might be you're looking at it and you're like, I've got to figure out how to disciple my kids, and that's where I need innovation. Or we need to figure out how we can love our neighbors well, because we don't know them. What would it look like for Jesus to be good news to our neighbors in a way that is new and fresh? Because most people don't know their neighbors well. So I think there are all these opportunities around us, but it's really the starting point is always, where is God at work? And then we can start thinking through what might come next.
Yeah, and that's the first step in your book, identification. You have 5 phases of kingdom innovation in your book, which makes it real simple. It's a good starting point, good framework. So once we identify, basically it's identifying a problem, or perhaps just a way something could be done better. Um, how do we move from there? It's easy to identify the problem. It's real hard to come up with the solution, right?
Yeah. So that second phase is what we call ideation, and we're trying to think through what are different ways that we could attack this problem. And I think the thing that is really important to think through in this phase is like, we don't actually need to know the answer in this phase. We just need to have something that we can test coming out of this phase. So I'll give you an example, Randy. It's You're thinking, all right, I really want to get to know my neighbors, and maybe like the thing that we've been talking about, we've been talking to other people, been looking at different ideas on Google or whatever. Uh, the thing that stands out is like, maybe we do a game night, and so that's we have decided we're going to do a game night, and we're going to invite some neighbors to the game. Now it could be that that none of them say yes, and you're like, all right, well maybe it's because this is never going to work, or it could just be that they're just not interested in a game night. Is there something else they might be interested in too? And I think the thing that we're really committed to when we're thinking about ideation is we want to be committed to principles that are universal, but there can be infinite practices of what that looks like. There are infinite numbers of ways that you can get to know your neighbor, but the principle is love your neighbor. That's the second commandment. And so I think the ideation thing is, we're not committed to having the solution right there, but something that we can try and see if it works coming out of it.
Yeah, and I think that the way you frame that is really important, and so I want to pause right there for a second, because what I've seen so many people do is get in the ideation phase where they're coming up with ideas, and someone has the best idea, and then you're married to it, And then if it doesn't work or doesn't perform as well as you thought, you 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 don't want to abandon it, and you don't want to call it a failure. We're afraid of failure, but yet, you mentioned Thomas Edison. Anybody that knows anything about him and his team, because it really was a team, they failed many, 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 many times. I mean, how how important is failure to success?
It's essential. I mean, that's the short answer. That you're not going to get to success if if you aren't expecting failure to be part of the process. Failure is stepping stones to getting to the other side where you do find innovation and success. And so the famous quote where just what you were saying with Edison, where he says like, look, we haven't found the light bulb yet, but we found 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. And they eventually do find it. And I think you need that kind of like dogged persistence that, hey, however long this thing takes, we're going to be committed to figuring out what works. And I actually think this is what's so critical about kingdom innovation is that we're not responding to this was successful or not because it worked or not. It's we're responding in obedience because God has asked us to do something. And I'm going to keep doing it and keep trying to figure out so that when it works, it's not that I get the glory. Because again, I'm not at the center of the story. The innovation's not the center of the story. Jesus is.
Yeah, and that can be tough when you put it in a spiritual framework like that, because I mean, Noah was building an ark for an awful long time before it was useful. Um, and I think there's a fine line between just being unreasonably wed to an idea and then knowing you heard from God and never giving up. Um, and from the outside, if you're looking at someone else and you're like, man, they've been doing that for years, it really hadn't worked. What's the deal? It's hard sometimes to know. I mean, are there any good guidelines to know whether, no, I'm actually being obedient in the face of adversity
Yeah.
because I heard God, or this is a bad idea and I need to move on?
I think the key to that one is having people in your life who are spiritually mature, who are willing to discern this with you.
Yeah.
Um, Look, there are a lot of people, Randy, who are just super stubborn. Like, and that's it. Like, it's just like, look, it's not even about whether or not God told them to do it. They are so convinced of this thing, not because of God, but because of them. And that's true of all of us. We all have blind spots where we're like that. And so what we need, and this is what the scriptures say over and over again, is that we need people around us who can say difficult things to us and we can join in the process of what it is that God is saying. Because if it's just like, look, I got my download from God and ain't nothing you can say, anyone, and I don't care how close you are to me or how spiritually mature, there's nothing you can say that's going to deter me. I think we find ourselves in a real dangerous place. And I think the scriptures say that over and over again. And I think it's no different when we're thinking through innovation.
Yep, we're talking to Doug Paul. This is his book, Ready or Not. It's about kingdom innovation for a brave new world. But a couple more steps that I do want to talk about. But I want to ask you what you are seeing as you go out and you are helping churches, especially this year. I talked about how COVID's forced a lot of innovation in the churches. What are you seeing, maybe good and bad, that's going on right now within the church?
Well, I think it's a little bit what you said. There's some good and there's some bad. I think one of the things that is good, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, is I think COVID is revealing who the people are in our churches who actually are spiritually mature. Because there's a group of people who, when COVID happened, they're like, all right, it's going to be in and out, and we're fine. But when it started to get to like 4 weeks in, 6 weeks in, 8 weeks in, and they were still having to do online or some variation that was different than what they wanted, there was a large group of people, Randy, who checked out. And they were like, you know what, I'm when things get back to normal, maybe I'll come back. And there's a group of people that have said, it's like they found brunch, like, oh, as it turns out, there's this beautiful meal on Sunday mornings called brunch, and they don't plan on ever coming back. But I think there's another group of people, and it's a good sized group of people who leaned in. And they said, like, look, I don't like online, or I don't like the way that the chairs are spread apart, and I don't like the way that we're having to do community right now. They didn't like any of it, but they leaned in anyway because they had spiritual muscles to do it. It said, for my health, my spiritual health, and the health of my brothers and sisters in Christ in this church, I'm in. Even if it's not what I would choose. That shows a level of maturity. And so I think what that is showing a lot of leaders right now is those are the people that you can build with in the future. It's really hard to know that you can build with people if they're not showing up when things get hard. It's easy to show up when you feel like you're the winning team. It's easy to
Yeah.
show up when you feel like everything's going your way, but when things get hard, that's when you find out who's in. And I
I,
think that's a good and a bad, but I think if we have eyes to see, it's a real gift.
yeah, yeah, and that's so true, and we're seeing it all over the place. So, in your book, when we're talking about kingdom innovation, we've got the identification of a problem, we've got the ideation, the coming up with possible ways to solve it, and we get into the experimentation where you're trying it, and we're seeing this across the country, specifically with the online methods of ministry. Um, the fourth one is mobilization, and that, well, I just would like you to explain that because I'm a little concerned that a lot of churches are going to find out, hey, this worked for us, good for us, pat ourselves on the back, and it never really help the rest of the church.
Yeah. Mobilization is once you have found that something works and that it works consistently, it's asking, why did it work? Like what are some of the mechanics
Mm-hmm.
of this thing, and how do we like shrink it down to the simplest version of it and spread it? How do we teach other people to do it? Like if it worked at one church, could it work at 1,000 churches? Or if it worked at 1,000 churches, could it work at 100,000 churches? If it worked with one Christian household in your neighborhood, could it work with 100 Christian households in your neighborhood? And it's really saying we're taking Jesus at his word, which I think sometimes we don't do that enough. And Jesus said, "Let me tell you what a return looks like in the kingdom. It's not a one-to-one return. It is a 10 times, 30 times, 60 times, 100-fold return." And the way that we get that kind of multiplication is when the people of God are mobilized. From when something starts small, God is through the power of the Holy Spirit, he is able to like blow that into all these different directions. But we are a part of that. We are a part of how God wants to see that happen. And so when we ask, why did it work? And we really put the work in training people, we can spread it.
Yeah, and I do a little bit of that here because that's why I ask people to share these interviews. If if you're watching and this strikes a chord and you're like, man, people need to hear this, use that share button, use the subscribe, and subscribe across the platforms. Not if you're on Facebook, go subscribe on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, go subscribe on Twitter or even Twitch. Figure out what Twitch is because that's a whole mission field unto itself. The multiplication, I think, is a principle that we think of only in monetary terms, unfortunately. And I think the church has been a little bit guilty of that at times. And I'm not saying that there can't be a huge financial return. We see this in business. It's sort of a business principle. But the multiplication aspect of it, I know you just really just kind of answered it, but I want people to get that because when God does something in our lives, it's for us, but it's not for us to just keep to ourselves. I mean, really, how critical is it that we get beyond just figuring out what works for us and really getting it out into the world? Because that's how we change the world.
Yeah, it's starting with the question, what does God want? Like, what does God want? Because God is the center of the story, and he has set up all of creation in a particular way. And the God of the universe came down in human flesh, and then he spent time and told us how the universe is set up and what his expectations are that he's going to deliver on. I'm not the one who's going to deliver on this. He is. And the way that he talked about the world working was around multiplication.
Mm-hmm.
That healthy things don't only grow, they also multiply.
Right.
And we see that over and over and over again. And so I think every grandparent gets this, right? They started with a family. Let's say there were four of them in the family, and then they had kids, and those kids had kids. And then and suddenly what started with a group of four is much bigger now because things have multiplied. And you take it back two more generations, it gets even bigger and even fuller as we get into great grandparents and great great grandparents. That's how the kingdom works that way. And in the same way that parenting and grandparenting works that way, it's not different in the other things that we do. And so I think sometimes Randy, it's as simple as the Lord has given you breakthrough, it's asking, all right, we've had the original, the feeding of the 5,000. There's been the multiplication of 5 loaves, 2 fishes, but now let's pick up all the breadcrumbs. That's the second act. Let's pick up all the breadcrumbs, and now we've got 12 basketfuls left over. What does God want to do with that? And taking the time and the discipline to actually say, what do you want to do next?
Yeah, and you make a very important point about that. You say work with the willing, and that can be a stopping point for a lot of people because they get excited, they feel like God wants to multiply, and they talk to a person or two, and there's just zero interest there. How important is it that when we know we've got something from God, that we find that fertile soil, and not get discouraged when we throw the seed out and it lands on the hard pavement and does nothing.
Yeah, it's discouraging. I mean, I think first and foremost, just it feels discouraging. And I think one of the power of that parable that you just mentioned is 3 out of the 4 soils aren't doing what that seed was designed for. That's not great. But one of them is good soil, and with patience and time, you get way more than the one seed. Because within every seed is forest potential. That one seed grows into one tree, but think of all the fruit and all the seeds on the one tree, and then just give it time and the winds of the Holy Spirit. But what we spend so much time doing is, rather than moving from discouragement to asking, okay, what do we do now? What we tend to do is we'll spend lots of time working with people and trying to convince them, and they already said no.
Yeah.
We've got a few people who said yes. And the people who are going to get the most discouraged are the people who said yes, who we're not spending time with, investing in this idea, whatever it might be, with them. They've said yes, they're waiting for you.
Mm-hmm.
But we're sitting here talking to all the no's, still trying to convince people. And we've got to, the thing you mentioned earlier, we've got to learn to work with the willing.
Yeah.
Put the majority of our time with the people who said yes, and let's go.
Yeah, and I think that is hugely valuable. I say advice, it's just a spiritual principle. This is not something that the two of us came up with. I mean, it's right out of the mouth of Jesus. Doug, explain a little bit to people about some of what you do, because I want people to, and we've talked about these ideas, these principles. I want to see how you are putting them into practice and helping others put them into practice.
Yeah. That's a great question. One of the challenges that the church is facing right now, it beyond COVID, this is pre-COVID, is that culture is changing and reinventing itself at a much faster rate than it used to. So for the vast majority of human history, it would reinvent roughly every 20 to 30 years. And in the last 10 years, and it has sped up to reinventing and shifting every 18 months. So what used to take 20 to 30 years, we're now smushing together in every 18 months, which means that the only thing that we can count on in life right now, other than Jesus, is that things will change. And the good news, Randy, is that, and this, is that the gospel is not at risk, and that the Church of Jesus Christ is not at risk. God is going to build his church. But it can feel like just mind bending trying to keep up. Like all the stuff that has changed in the last 10 years socially. Just think about that in 10 years. It's like our mind, it's like whiplash. We have mental, emotional, spiritual whiplash just trying to keep up. And so what it is that we do, and I work with a help lead a team called Catapult, is we work with churches, we work with nonprofits, we work with businesses who are going after the common good, and we are helping them figure out innovative ways to be about the gospel in the midst of a culture that has no fixed points anymore and is changing, changing, changing all the time.
You know Bobby Grunwald?
Yeah, I don't know him well, but yes.
He works with Craig Rochelle. For those of you who don't know, he works with Craig Rochelle at Life Church, and he is the one who developed the YouVersion app. Which, if you don't have a Bible app on your phone, just go get YouVersion. It's truly fabulous, and he relates some really great stories about that. Because its first iteration was a website and it was not doing well. And someone said, you should just do an app. And he was like, well, no, because they were kind of committed to the website. They finally did the app, it took off. He talks about creating a culture of change. And he had a great illustration at this event I went to in January this year. They come into the office and they don't go, oh no, what happened? We have to change? Which is the way really most of us approach it, especially in the church and ministries that are, especially if they've been around for any kind of period of time. They come in and say, okay, what can we change today? Not for the sake of change, but to improve it. It's looking for those very small, slight changes oftentimes that improve the effectiveness of what you're doing. And that goes to right what you're saying, is that the ones that will be the most effective right now are the ones that are comfortable with change, because the world is changing so fast and it is hard to keep up with at times. But that, to me, that also says opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you see in the way of opportunity right now for individuals, churches, businesses, ministries, all of us?
I think there is a wave of opportunity that is going to be hitting very soon, and a lot of it revolves around this little device we call a smartphone. It takes about 10 years for research to come back around how something as new like a smartphone impacts us. And so the first iPhone came out in 2008, and the first wave of research that was really in depth for how it changes and shapes us came back in 2018, 2019. And it's not good. Like the way that this little device is shaping us and changing the way our mind works and our heart works and the way that we interact with people, there are a few positives, but it is overwhelmingly negative. And one of the things that you see everyone like actually owning, at least in American culture, is I'm addicted to this thing. So 79% of people would say they are addicted to their cell phone. The average person scrolls on their phone 5.4 hours a day, which means this thing, which was meant to bring connectivity and freedom, is actually bringing a form of slavery. And I think there is a wave of opportunity for churches and Christians to, one, break that addiction themselves, because we are tied to it too much. But two, what would it look like to offer that breakthrough for other people? And there are ways of talking about that level of freedom that can only be found in God, in the same way that Alcoholics Anonymous started because someone was just desperate enough and was just like, I don't want to live like this anymore. And the only way that they eventually got to that freedom was through Jesus. I think we're going to see some stuff that's going to be like that with churches and with technology.
Interesting that we sit here and use technology to talk about all the great innovations.
Yeah.
And your vision for the future is how to break us from addiction to the very technology that we're utilizing.
Yeah, because I mean, my personal bent is that it's not like this is one of those things that you can use in moderation.
Yeah.
There's some people that can't, and so we should have conversations around that. Most people can, but it's so new that we don't know how to use it yet.
Right, right,
We just
right.
don't know how to use it.
If you'd have asked me how long we had smartphones, I'd have said way before 2008. It just feels like we've had them forever.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. A lot to think about. And so, you guys watching, I hope you'll take a moment to say, Lord, what's the problem that you can show me that I can have an impact on? And if you need a little guidelines, pick up this book right here. You threw me with the title. So Ready or Not is the title.
It is.
It's in white, right back here, giant.
We
behind.
went with an artistic choice.
Yeah, and so I thought the title of the book was Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. That literally looked like the title. You just look for Doug Paul. You can find it. In fact, if you go to his website here at dougpaul.org, you can find more about him, his articles, and his speaking of availability, I should say. But check out those two resources. And then I would just encourage you to take a step back and say, Lord, what would you have me do? I really think that we underestimate our role as problem solvers in this world. And that's what opens the door to preach the gospel and to demonstrate the gospel into people's lives. So, Doug, I'll leave you with the last word. Anything you want to say to people before we're out of here today?
I think just keep up the faith. It's been a tough year. There are three questions that we've when we're working with leaders, we're asking them. And so there are ones that I would encourage you to ask yourself. One, what has 2020 taken from you? So this is about grief. What has 2020 given to you? This is about blessing. And what have you learned in 2020? This is about the wisdom that you can take forward.
Those are good, and coming up on Thanksgiving, good time to maybe reflect and look at those three things. You know what? Out of those three questions could come some massive innovation on sharing God's kingdom here on this earth. So that's good. That's good. Do check out the website. Join us again. We've got more great guests this week. I'm loaded this week, and so it's going to be fun. And as we kind of get to the end of this year that's been so difficult for a lot of people, I really think Doug's onto something, and to say, Lord, what have we learned, and what can we do? Because it's God's will. Thy kingdom come, not us go out of here. Thy kingdom come, which means God's will is done here on earth as it is in heaven. And you are called to be a part of that if you are a believer. And if you're not, then I would invite you to talk to somebody and let them show you what it means to be a Christian. So good. Doug, again, thank you. Appreciate everything that you're doing out there, and appreciate you guys that are watching out there and sharing and subscribing and following. And let's keep doing it. We're gonna see, I think, some real reaping of harvest here very soon, not just in my country, but in yours as well around the world. And we're on the front lines. So let's look forward to it and be ready for it. See you next time.
Thank you for joining us live on the air.
My pleasure.
Television, the drug of the nation, breeding ignorance and feeding radiation TV.
You're the fruit. You're the fruit. You're the fruit. Exploits